Have you ever watched a show and thought, wow, this really says a lot about the time that it was made in? Well, that's exactly what happened when I watched I Dream of Jeannie, a lighthearted 1960s sitcom. But at first glance, it may seem like a funny show about a genie and an astronaut, but in actuality, it's full of messages about gender roles, power, and the expectations placed on women back then. When you take a closer look, the characters and the way they interact reveal a lot about the culture at the time. In this video, I'm going to break down how the show connects to some important sociological ideas using I Dream of Jeannie Season 1, Episode 1 as an example. I'll touch on conflict theory, Freud's psychosexual phallic stage, Cooley's looking glass self, gender role socialization, and the clear misogyny just presented throughout the episode. So, let's get started. Originally developed by Karl Marx, conflict theory looks at society as a competition for limited resources. So, in other words, society is divided into different social classes, and those in power just want to maintain control. In I Dream of Jeannie, we see this power imbalance play between Major Nelson and Jeannie. Tony Nelson holds all the power. He works, he makes decisions, and he even controls Jeannie, who, despite having magical genie powers, can't use them without his approval. She is constantly expected to serve him, setting a perfect example of how women in the 1960s were expected to be obedient to men, whether that be at home or in the workplace. There's also a power imbalance based on gender as well. Major Nelson is a white, middle-class military man, pretty much at the top of his social ladder. But on the flip side, Jeannie is a foreign woman with magical powers, but she's treated like his property. Her status is way lower than Tony's, and she's expected to submit to him, despite being more powerful. This clearly shows that men in position of power, especially those in military and government, have maintained control over women, like women, foreigners, and other groups that can be seen as lesser than them. I think another thing to consider is the lack of diversity in the show. The cast is all white, it's set in a military environment, which is, a powerful institution in American society, yet there's no people of color in the show. This lack of representation reinforces the idea that power and importance belongs in a specific group, that being white American males. Conflict theory argues that this lack of diversity isn't accidental, but it helps protect the power and the dominance of the in-group by making everyone else invisible, which can limit the progress towards equality. Let's talk about Freud's phallic stage of psychosexual development. According to Freud, this stage happens between the ages of 3 and 6, and it's when kids start to become aware of their bodies, developing desires for the opposite sex parent. Freud believed that unresolved issues during the stage can impact gender identity later on. In Jeannie's case, we can see this possible link of the phallic stage in how her character is portrayed. Jeannie's behavior is super flirtatious and seductive, constantly trying to seek Tony's approval and attention. And she even gets jealous when other women, like Tony's fiancé, get too close to him. This can be seen as the need for male validation that Freud was talking about. But Tony, on the other hand, he plays the dominant father figure role, holding authority over Jeannie. She even calls him master, and she always looks for him for guidance. This is similar to the power dynamic that Freud described, where the same-sex parent holds the authority, and the child, or in this case, Jeannie, seeks approval from the opposite sex parent. Cooley's looking glass self theory suggests that we develop our sense of self based on how others would perceive us. So from my research, I found that this theory follows 3 steps. First, we imagine how we appear to others. Second, we imagine how others judge us. And third, we develop feelings and responses based on how we think that others see us. So Jeannie's character is constantly shaping her actions based on how Tony perceives her. For example, she dresses in ways she thinks will please him, and even goes out of her way to help him without asking. When Tony disapproves of her using her powers, Jeannie feels bad and tries to adjust her behavior based on what she believes that he wants. This shows that Jeannie's self-worth is entirely tied to how she thinks Tony sees her. Her identity is shaped with his perception, which means she's constantly adjusting her behavior to conform to his expectations, which is a clear example of the looking glass self in action. Jumping to gender role socialization, this is the process in which people learn the societal expectations for their gender. It starts from a young age and continues throughout life. In I Dream of Jeannie, Jeannie represents the ideal woman of the 1960s. She's submissive, loyal, and entirely focused on pleasing Major Nelson. She's expected to be obedient and polite, always dependent on him, asking for his permission before doing anything. Her behavior, clothes, and flirtatiousness reflect how women were sexualized at the time, while still being expected to be innocent and devoted. Meanwhile, Tony is the traditional male role. He's rational, dominant, and the one in charge. He's the provider and the authority figure. When Jeannie doesn't act like how he expects, he gets frustrated. This is a clear example of how women's independence was seen as a threat back then, and how normalized it was for men to be the one in control. Misogyny is the discrimination against women, and it's pretty obvious in I Dream of Jeannie. Jeannie is literally owned by Tony, who is referred to as her master. Her powers are controlled by him, and she's expected to serve him without question. This reinforces the old school gender roles where women were seen as subversives to men. And what's worse is that her powers are treated like a nuisance or like a problem rather than something to be embraced. This shows that women's competence was often seen as like a threat or something that needed to be contained. Jeannie's character is also sexualized, often being dressed in revealing clothing and acting naive and childlike. This clearly displays how women were expected to be both powerless and objects of desire at the same time. Jeannie's worth is measured by her relationship with Tony, not by any achievement she made, her abilities, who she is as a person in general. Overall, watching I Dream of Jeannie through an academic lens really made me think about how media has shaped people's view over time, especially when it comes to gender or power. And honestly, I'd say it was a little frustrating to see how Jeannie was treated. She wasn't allowed to have control or value outside of a man. I think that part just really touched me because I was raised with this mindset of being a traditional woman. And I was the one that had to break that mindset on my own. At the same time, I think this project helped me realize how important it was to recognize these patterns and really digest what I was watching. It shows how far we've come as a society, but also reminds us how much of this mindset still exists in just more subtle ways today. My favorite part of watching this was probably just catching all the little things I wouldn't have noticed before, like how a small look or reaction from Tony can affect Jeannie so much. It gave me a better understanding of older generations too, with what they grew up with watching and how it may shape their beliefs. In the end, this just made me see that even the most outdated or ridiculous shows have a lot of meaning once you dig behind a little deeper.